Ladies and gentlemen, I am now delighted to introduce Mr. Dexter Filkins, staff writer at The New Yorker, for an Insight series, The Next Battlefield, How AI Will Transform the Future of Warfare.
Oh boy. Hey everybody. Yeah, thank you. The great American writer Cormac McCarthy, he wrote a novel called Blood Meridian, a terribly violent and very dark novel, but absolutely terrific. He said in the novel, when God got here, war was waiting for him. And I think that was a very artful way of saying that war has always been with us, and it probably always will be, and it's because it's part of the human condition. I think he's right about that, unfortunately. But at the same time, war is this terrible constant throughout our history. At the same time, it's always changing itself. Like how we wage war on each other is kind of constantly evolving. And that's really happening right now, very, very quickly all over the globe. And so I went to a couple places this year over the summer to kind of take a look at a couple of those places. I went to Ukraine, and then I went to Israel and Gaza. And those are two kind of real-time laboratories that are really, really fascinating to kind of watch how events are unfolding there. So the first place I just want to talk about, I want to talk for 15 minutes, and if I go over, I want you to come up here and get me. I want to talk about Ukraine, what I saw there, and then talk about Israel. And then I just want to talk kind of briefly about what I think that means for the United States, because I think it means a lot, and I think we're kind of pretty far behind the curve right now. So, and I think there's a kind of realization of that in the Pentagon. But so over the summer, I went to Ukraine, and God, it was amazing. And you all know the story. The Russians rolled in, 3.5 years ago, thinking it was going to be a walk in the park, and here we are. 3 years later, the Ukrainians have basically beaten them to a standstill. They've inflicted more than a million casualties, but they've kind of hung on, and there's a lot of reasons for that. They've obviously gotten a lot of help. They've gotten a lot of help from us, but if you could boil it down to one factor, I think it's fair to say it's drones. Like that's what's enabled Ukraine to survive. Last year, the Ukrainians made 2 million drones, and they weren't doing any of this 3 years ago. They made 2 million drones last year. This year, they'll probably make 4 million. I think since 2024, 70% of the Russian casualties were inflicted by drones. And so if you're God help you, if you're a 19-year-old Russian recruit that got, 2 weeks of training, and there's like a guy behind you with a gun telling you to go forward, the Ukrainians call it the drone wall. You just run right into a wall of drones. And the Ukrainians, because of drones, they have round-the-clock, perfect visibility of the battlefield. Ukraine is as flat as a pool table, and so they run right into it. And that's basically, it's a bloodbath on the front. But basically, the Ukrainians have been able to survive because in the space of 3 years, they've figured out how to do this, and they've kind of, they've created this kind of whole new way of war. And they've also figured out how to make this stuff. And the key to all of it, the key to the drones, and I think a lot of you probably know this, but it's how to mass produce very cheap, but very, very precise stuff. And that's what they're doing. And I wanted to see that up close. So I went to Kyiv, and I talked to this Ukrainian guy named Alexander Yakovenko. And before the war, he was like working in Odessa. He was like a shipping guy, and he got a phone call when the invasion happened from somebody in the president's office, and they said, "Can you make drones?" And he said, "Well, hell, I'll try." And so he's got 7 factories around the country now. And I asked him if I could see one of them, and so they said yes, but these are secret locations because if the Russians knew where they were, they would bomb them. So I was blindfolded and taken in a car to Western Ukraine. They took the blindfold off, standing inside this drone factory. And it's like half the size of this room. It's tiny. It's like it feels like more like an office building than a factory. You know, there's people putting together carbon fiber frames, and they're doing video simulations. It's all very quiet. Mostly women were putting this stuff together. And it was extraordinary. This little place that I saw, Yakovenko's little factory, they were making 1,000 drones a day, every day. And they're going right to the front. And so when you sit there, when you pick one of these things up, it's like nothing, you know? And that's the key to it. It's nothing. It's like, it's this big, it's like a little square, and it has these little propellers on it. And then there's like a motor, and there's a video camera, and there's like a bomb rack. And that's it. Like that's it. It costs $500. And you know, they got reams and reams of videos of a $500 drone hitting a $20 million, you know, Russian artillery piece. And you know, everybody cheers. But that's the key to the war. That's it. That's the asymmetry, which is for $500, and maybe you got to fire 10 of them, you can take out something that costs 20 times as much. And that's what's happening right now. That's the kind of extraordinary dynamic that they've kind of engineered on their own, and it's just remarkable. But think about that, because it has great resonance for the United States, which we'll talk about in a second. So after I went to Ukraine, I went to Israel. And you all know there's been, and you're talking about it today, there's been this, you know, kind of terrible war for more than 2 years happening there. And what's happening there that's really interesting, which I went there to talk about, was the Israelis are using artificial intelligence to target people. And so the way to understand it is, and it took me a while to kind of figure it out, was the Israelis, you know, they've been to war like 1,000 times in the past 40 years. Whenever they go to war, they're ready, and they have what they call a target bank. And so for Hamas, I think they had 2,000 targets. For Hezbollah, 10,000. And like the target bank is basically like, here's a guy, you know, Yahya Sinwar, and here's his kind of vital statistics, and where he lives, and who he associates with, and all the phone numbers and all the buildings he's visited, and everything we think he's said that's important over the last. They got a big file. And so if the war starts, kill that guy. So what happened on October 7th, 2023 was the Israelis, at least, and I sat with the IDF guys for quite a while, they shot through that target list like in a few days. You know, they just tore through it in Gaza. I mean, Hezbollah is slightly different, but bigger target list. But in Gaza, they just shot right through it. And that's when they brought in the artificial intelligence. And so they have, in Israel, they've developed these programs, and they have names. There's a program called Lavender. There's another one called Gospel. And then there's my personal favorite, Where's Daddy? And what these do, as opposed to like the target list they have that is like identifiable people with names, these programs help them identify people whose identities they don't know. So the programs just amass and synthesize just oceans and oceans of material, like everything you can imagine. So it's like drone feeds, video feeds, cell phone conversations, in Arabic that they've translated, social media posts, driving patterns, property records. Everything you can imagine they dump into these computers. And when the war was kind of first starting, you can track this. The Israelis, the IDF was renting enormous amounts of bandwidth from people like Google and Microsoft because they were just processing loads and loads of information. And so what happens, and I had a long conversation. It was a completely bizarre conversation, but I mean, very, very interesting. But I met a targeter with the IDF, and we had like a 3-hour lunch in a cafe like overlooking the Mediterranean, and we talked about all this stuff. And basically, he was in charge of he was an officer, and he was in charge of a targeting team of 16 people. And the way that Gospel and Lavender in these programs work is they don't give you a name, they just give you a place. And they'll say, there's an 80% certainty that at that place there's a bad guy. You should kill him. And so I think the IDF is like very clear about this. They're like, look, the computers aren't killing people. Like those are ultimately human decisions. And so the way, I think, this isn't his real name, but I think I called him Michael in my story, the targeter. He said, we get a recommendation. It's a priority list. And so it'll say, here's a point on the map, 70% certainty this is a bad guy with Hamas, with Hezbollah. So he said it was our duty to try to independently verify it and check it out. So we would like try to send a drone over, we would do whatever we could. And he said, like in the heat of the battle, it was, we did the best we could. But he said, and he made it really clear that most of the recommendations they rejected from Lavender and Gospel and Where's Daddy. So they were sort of very clear, and I think they were very adamant about this, that the computers weren't running the war. And so I found it slightly, it was hard to judge. I mean, the Israeli military is pretty pleased with the way the AI systems have helped them target people. But at the same time, of course, you've got extraordinary damage in Gaza and incredible civilian casualties. We all know that. We don't know how many. There's a lot of propaganda, but tens of thousands for sure civilians have died. And so I tried to sort of figure out like how do those two things fit together. And what Michael, the targeter, said to me at one point, he said that it was the rules of engagement were very, very loose in the beginning of the war. And so, as he describes, he said, in the beginning, if we got a target from Lavender or Gospel or one of these places, hit this. He said, let's say it's a bad guy and it's in a market. If we could kill that guy, we were allowed to kill as many as 20 civilians in order to take him out. And that's a really high number. Think about that. And he said that number came down, but in the initial stages of the war, those numbers are very high. If you can kill that guy, you take out 20 innocent people. And I remember I was sort of struck by that. And I remember I called somebody who I had known at the Pentagon, or I knew at the Pentagon. And I said, like, is that what you guys do? And he said, if we had done that one time, like in the Iraq War, he said, if we said, like, we need to kill 20 civilians in order to kill this one guy, he said, a decision like that would go all the way to the White House. That's how extraordinary. He said, the amazing thing is the Israelis are doing it several times a day. And so I think, it's an interesting picture that kind of emerges from Gaza and on AI, but I think we're gonna hear a lot more about this. So I just want to talk about, like, what does this mean for us, for the United States? And I think it means a lot. And for the last 30 years, the Pentagon has basically focused on making very, very expensive, utterly exquisite, state-of-the-art stuff. And so you have an aircraft carrier, it takes a decade to make, it costs $10 billion. We have 11 of them. Or an F-35 fighter jet, it's the best in the world, it costs $100 million. We have 100 of those. And just the other day, an aircraft carrier, I think it was the Gerald Ford in the Red Sea or in the Gulf of Arabia, was kind of engaging with the Houthis, and the Houthis are like, they're driving around in rowboats, and the aircraft carrier kind of swung around, and 2 F-35s went off the deck and sank to the bottom of the ocean. There's $200 million, like right there, and a good chunk of our air fleet, right there. And so what's happening, and I think what's happening in the Pentagon, and it's happening right now, is there's this realization that, oh my God, we have put ourselves in a terribly vulnerable position. We've built these incredibly expensive things. We don't have that many of them. Imagine if one of those aircraft carriers is in the South China Sea and there's 1,000 missiles coming at it. Can they knock down all 1,000? What if they only get 900 or 950? And so that's what they're kind of facing right now. And so at the Pentagon moves about as slowly as an aircraft carrier. turns about as slowly as an aircraft carrier. They're trying to kind of grapple with this stuff right now. And I think I only have a few more minutes. So I focused on this American company that's kind of trying to do this. And it's called Anduril. And Anduril was founded by this like super interesting kind of crazy tech guy, Palmer Luckey, who at age 19 built this virtual reality headset like in his garage, and he sold it for $2 billion. And he's a patriot, and he wants to kind of, keep the Chinese at bay. So he's been making sort of the American equivalent of the Ukrainian drones. But they're very, very interesting, and they're high tech, and they're interesting. But what Palmer's doing, and it's so interesting, is the way they look at their weapons is, it's like, okay, here's a cruise missile. Like literally, it's a cruise missile, and he's like, this is as easy to put together as a piece of IKEA furniture. I mean, which admittedly isn't always very easy, but he's like, you need 10 tools that you can have at home, and you can slap this thing together. And what really, really matters about this is the software. It's all about the software. The rest of it, they're building a factory in Ohio. They're just going to mass produce this stuff at high speed. And that's what they're doing. And so, but the most interesting thing and the most disturbing thing that Palmer said to me was, and he's a really interesting guy, he said, every single weapon that we're building with the assumption that we will lose communication with it. Like we will be cut off from communicating with our weapons. And so what that means is they have to act on their own. They have to act independently. Like we have to give them brains. And so think about that. And I'll leave you with this. I had a conversation with, I think he's formerly the CEO of Anduril, Brian Schimpf. He's like a brilliant guy. And Brian said, well, you're dealing with the Pacific. It's millions of square miles. But he's like, imagine there's a fleet of Chinese ships coming through the South China Sea. These are vast areas. He's like, what we're essentially planning on is, we can fire our missiles. We've lost communication with them. Those missiles on their own will find the Chinese ships, identify them, attack them. They will communicate with each other and kind of sort out who's going to do what so they don't duplicate their tasks. And they're all going to do that. They're going to do that on their own, with their own brains. And so it's kind of fun to think about, It's remarkable how fast we're moving and how fast things are changing, but like that is, you can kind of imagine how that could be easily a scene from like Terminator, when the rise of the machines, I think was the subtitle. So it's a pretty exciting future, but it's also pretty terrifying at the same time. But all that's kind of happening very, very rapidly. So on that note, on that happy note, I'm gonna go have a cup of coffee. Thank you. Thank you very much.